So what also happened after the announcement of the release of the patch and after the PTR tuning for the specs, there is also another tuning that happened in the PTR, which was the one to the dungeons. Now, this is not just important, for example, if you don't care about this because you don't even know about the dungeons anyways, so knowing that this ability has been nerfed by 35%, what do I know about it? It's also relevant because there is a more basic change that will affect all of Mythic Plus, and it can be seen as a very good thing or a very bad thing. So first, talking about the actual changes to the dungeons, in general, they are of course all positive because they are nerfs. There's nothing really, anything being buffed or being made harder. It's mostly just damage being nerfed. Talking about the difficulty of the dungeons, at least based on the amount of times and also the levels of the priory being completed, it was the hardest one. You have multiple keys being done at the 14 and even 15 range, and some of the more undertuned like Floodgate being done even at 16 key level. Priory, not really. Priory was much tougher, especially the first part. The first two chunks of the dungeon up to the second boss were the most how do we call them, aids like compared to other dungeons. Talking mostly about Thrash, not the boss. The annoying boss of the dungeon would have been the last boss, the Prioress. It does have quite a hefty healing check. Most of the nerfs here are to the Thrash as well as to the Prioress herself. Mostly really on the damage of the swarm of adds coming to you when you change phases. Besides that, most of the other changes were to Thrash, like replacing annoying casting Thrash you have to keep an eye out on for just generic Risen Footmans instead. That's good. You have the Rookery changes, very positive, especially the last boss. Voidstone Monstrosity wasn't a particularly difficult boss. It's not even a particularly difficult healing check. You know, if you're not getting close to 2 million HPS in these fights, it's not really a difficult one. It's not even a lot of damage taken. It's more really just the technicality of dealing with the unstable corruption, explosions, the adds, and the null upheavals you have to manage as a group. So it's more of a case of coordination rather than stat checks, for example. So having the Void Fragments from Null Upheaval going down to 3, having Null Upheaval itself spawning Void Fragments more spread around, and also the adds themselves having 20% less HP. Those are all positive changes. Cinderbrew Meadery is pretty funny to have the removal of a patrol of higher muscles in the testing room. You still have the problem that there are going to be at least 2 of these higher muscles in the area that you have to deal with, and these are very, very dangerous to fight with anything else. It's kind of like what you have right now, for example, in Grim Battle, the double pull of the tank busters on Grim Battle, which is quite nasty. These are going to be that version of Season 2 in Cinderbrew Meadery, these higher muscles. Now there is one fewer one of these patrolling muscles. Besides that, the biggest chunk of nerfs is going to Darkflame Cleft. So Old Waxbeard is pretty funny because to players who haven't gone in the PTR, players who just remember Darkflame Cleft for doing some like daily heroic run or whatever. So you just kind of get to ignore most of the mechanics. You're not quite sure what most of the mechanics do anyways because the bosses just die too quickly. Well, that's obviously not going to work in Mythic Plus. You will actually, I'm afraid, have to do these mechanics. And for Darkflame Cleft, it was quite nasty. And the first boss already, Old Waxbeard, the one that there is the cart, and when you do it in Pugs, in Heroic, you just see a bunch of adds spawning, you're just focusing the boss, eventually the boss dies and whatever. That's actually not gonna work like way in Mythic Plus. You actually have to deal with the cart, which used to have a massive amount of HP, and also in terms of damage, the adds were actually blasting the players with their ticking damage weapons by hitting them. Nerfs, now you have the cart being much lower HP as well as the charge doing reduced damage. That's not the biggest of the changes. The Candle King would have been this season, probably will still be this season's HPS check. That's what it does right now in Darkflame Cleft. It's really high HPS requirements. If we go back, for example, comparing the healing of the first boss, which is 1.1 million HPS from the healer, even Blazikron, it's 600,000 HPS from the healer. The Darkness, 600,000 HPS from the healer, and then up to the Candle King, it's 2.5 million. It's really just the spawn of the, what's the name, wax statues. Yeah, it's the spawn of the wax statues that the more you have out, the more ticking damage they are doing. So of course, the more they spawn, the more you have to consistently heal with these statues being out. It's kind of like Synchron, right? With the copies being out, the copies of the players being out, you tick more and more damage out when they blow up. It's the same thing. Now, this is being nerfed across the board. You have the damage itself being reduced by 16%. You also have throw Darkflame's damage, the boss throw on 2 players. Now it's on 3 players, and the damage is reduced by 25%. This is always good. It's always good to take one huge hit and spread it around, even if it's for the same damage. Instead of having a 10 million hit on 1 player, it's always better to have a 1 million hit on 10 players or a 2 million hit on 5 players than having a 10 million hit on 1. Why? Because Mythic Plus scales, which means that while not this hit on 2 players could have been a problem on a plus 12, you might have reached a level at plus 17 where the hit on 2 players was starting to get close to a one-shot. And now the problem will be delayed because now the damage is reduced because it's hitting 3 players, which is always a good change. As well as very big changes to the darkness fight. Most of this around the light mechanic. You have the candlelight now has a 20% wider radius. The degen rate of the candle is 50%. The minimum light radius is now 33%, even when you're very low in light. As well as, good enough, lower value to Corridor Creeper and Shuffling Horror's enemy force, so you can just sort of ignore them and not feel like you need to go and do these as you carry the cart to the last boss, because they give less value, less trash count than they currently do. These changes are not nearly as big for Mechagon, for Motherlord, and for Theater of Pain. The one actually more meaningful change is that now the timer of the Motherlord is down to 33 minutes from 39. Same goes for Theater of Pain, down to 35 from 38. The more relevant one is the affront to Challenger large sets of nerfs. This was changed in the way it works. Now you don't kill one and then the other and then the other. You are practically encouraged to take them down at the same time, which made the fight much harder, especially having to keep Dessia, the tank buster boss, alive for the entire fight. That was a big problem. So it's got a bunch of nerfs. Now it melee auto-attacks less often. The Mortal Strike heal reduction has now been reduced to 30% instead of 50. The Mighty Smash cast time is lengthened to 4 seconds. Passaran does less melee auto-attack damage. No more Plague Bolt random casting to players. And now Satel has Withering Touch hitting 2 players instead of 5. So just a large amount of damage nerfs to the first boss, which turned out somehow to becoming like the hardest of the bosses after the initial change they gave this dungeon, as well as more flat damage reduction to Floodgate, which is interesting because, as I mentioned, it was the easiest dungeon in the PTR in terms of how deep, how high players were pushing the key in the PTR. So pretty much damage reduction on 2 different bosses, as well as the snipe damage of the Mechadrum Sniper also being reduced. So all of this has overall damage nerfs for most dungeons, whether it was bosses or whether it was trash mobs. The addition to all of these changes is what we mentioned, the global change to Mythic Plus, which is the health of all creatures has been reduced by 10% in Mythic and Mythic Keystone dungeons. Initially, you would think this would be good. However, there have been many arguments for this also being bad. Why would this be bad? I want things to be easy, I want enemies to be nerfed, so it's cool to kill them more quickly. Well, the problem is that Mythic Plus is an infinite difficulty, which means that there is no benchmark that you can reach and then stop, besides where you get your loot and where you get your quests, right? Those are the 2 only benchmarks. Plus 10, now with the scaling increasingly higher gilded crests and the new addition, it's gonna be plus 12, where you want to stop, right? However, these changes are not really that relevant for that key level, because you were getting to plus 12 anyways, you were getting to plus 10 anyways. It's not that the biggest problem was the mob HP in those dungeons. You weren't really that strapped for time either. You could wipe 2 or 3 times. You could finish. You could time keys at plus 10 or plus 11 right now with like 20 deaths, and you still can. So it's not that much of a problem. The problem is that when you go towards the higher key level, you are going to be stopped by one of two things. You're stopped because A, you don't have damage. So enemies are sponges. Enemies soak too much damage. It takes too long for you to kill these mobs. This is somewhat like Shadowlands, where the meta of healers, for example, was often scripted based on who had the most damage, because healing wasn't that great, or rather the requirements of healing weren't very high, so most healers could reach that requirement, and at that point what was more important was who gets to do more damage. Other times that could be the other situation, which is how can we survive? We actually have the damage, we can actually time the key. In fact, we could time the key 3 levels higher than this one with our damage. However, we just can't survive. We're getting hit by mechanics doing too much damage, and we just don't have the amount of defensives, we don't have the amount of survival tools to stay alive, so we just can't get past that, right? Those are the two blocks you can have in Mythic Plus. Either you raise so high that the damage isn't very high, the damage taken isn't very high, but you simply don't have enough damage yourself, tying the key, or you have more than enough damage, but you raise the key so high that damage starts to become one-shots, and you don't have the tools to survive the one-shot. Why decreasing the health of enemies but not the damage? So the damage stays the same, they just have less HP. The reason why this is bad is, and we're gonna help ourselves with our friend Paint over here, the reason why this is bad is because assuming both of these, let's just say, both of these problems are stopping you from progressing. So on one side, what can stop you is the DPS. And on the other side, we're gonna call it HPS, but what we mean by that is what can stop you is staying alive. You know, this helps you. You need this to stay alive in the key. So if previously, let's just say in an imaginary scenario, you were blocked at the same level, and then Blizzard says, no, now we are giving minus 10% HP to enemies. What this causes means that, okay, if we were blocked by not having enough DPS, we can go higher, because now you don't need nearly as much because enemies have less HP. We can go higher and higher and higher until we are stopped again. And we're now accounting for this 10% HP. It has allowed us to go up this much. But the only thing that this is doing is that this will now desync. This will now desync the blocks, the caps, between the limits you have from your damage and the limits you have from your survival tools. And desyncing it this way means that you will always reach a point now, with this change, you will always reach a point where you will always have enough damage, and the problem will always be that you cannot stay alive. Because you will always, compared to how strong the enemies are, you will always have more this than more of this. You will always have a higher ceiling, a higher cap, a higher potential for damage, because this was added, because now all enemies have 10% less HP. So you will always go higher in how far you can push it with your damage than you can with staying alive. Which means that eventually all of your problems in Mythic Plus will end up being, we can't stay alive, we can't survive. So everything will go back to finding healers, of course, with the strongest HPS, but not just the strongest HPS, the strongest survival tools. So tanky healer plus good externals to stay alive, plus potentially good DPS with strong enough defensives, possibly also trinkets, back to the time of using Absorb Shield trinkets, which there are already, by the way, a couple very powerful Absorb trinkets in Season 2, so that's also something you will have to go for. That's what it will become, again, with this change, because you are now desyncing the maximum power level between staying alive and doing damage with this, now you will always have a higher power to your damage than the possible power to your defensive. So you will never go in the opposite direction. You will never be in a situation where, oh, we can continue to push because we are fine staying alive, but we just lack the damage. So we need to try to push as much damage as we can. That will never happen. You will always be in a situation where what you need to min-max to the most possible will be your staying alive. And this is, somewhat annoying simply because you only have one healer in your group. So most of the focus, most of the pressure and the stress will go on the healer, but also most of the inventive to try to come up with new things to staying alive. It's not gonna focus too much on the DPS. How can we pull this to do more damage? How can we maximize our DPS? Generally, because DPS is the most popular role, of course, you would like to have that be your main focus in Mythic Plus. How can we do more damage? How can we maximize our damage? Because there are more players into doing damage. But with this change, you are just going to focus more on staying alive. You're just going to focus more on being defensive, basically. If it was in reverse, if by some wacky example, the change was all damage of all creatures has been reduced by 20%, then it would have been the opposite. You would have been able to push 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 keys. Until then, the stop would have been, we just don't have enough damage and we need to try to find ways to push our damage. That's why I said this can be seen as a very good thing or a very bad thing, because there are some players who will just take this at face value. They log in, they see Mythic Plus changes, they see 10% global health nerf of enemies. Good, enemies are weaker, I'm happy. However, as mentioned, Mythic Plus scales infinitely. So even if the health is weaker, okay, now instead of stopping, instead of reaching your peak at a plus 14, now you can go up to a plus 16. And what happens now? What happens is that now mobs do 20% more damage than before, and nothing else changed. And now you have a harder time staying alive. That's the problem that you have with this change. Some players see it as good because they just care about their weekly 10, or next season their weekly 12. But as I mentioned, this was not a make and break of making it in or out of a plus 12. I understand though, it's still in general good for the general population, especially at the start of the season. It's not that plus 12s will be free, and most players, I think the average Mythic Plus key completed, I think, is like a plus 7 or a plus 6 even. It's actually the average. So yeah, it's still good for lower levels, but the ability to time a key at those levels was so far not because of the time, so far not because you needed more time, and so nerfing the enemies by 10% HP was going to help them. If they were running out of time in a plus 7, for example, they would have had to have like 50 deaths. And I don't think at that point the problem is the mobs had 10% more HP. If only the mobs were 10% squishier, it would have been fine. I think that wasn't going to be the issue. So I think that this can be seen as a negative once you start pushing higher keys, because eventually, thanks to enemies being squishier, you will be able to push higher keys, which means you will face the block of can we stay alive earlier than you would have. If, for example, this change was the health of all creatures and the damage of all creatures is reduced by 10%. I think that not reducing them both together is what is the problem here. Yes, base abilities of a bunch of different mobs and bosses are being nerfed, so it's not like completely skewed that way, but I still think it would have been nice to nerf both of them at the same time, because this would favor a bit too much a side, a feature of Mythic Plus which is not exactly the favorite of players. When you think about Mythic Plus, you're not thinking about how do I stagger my defensives properly, how do I place my health zone or my health potion properly, but rather just how do I do top damage, how do I maximize my damage. And that's what would be cooler for more players to be into, and this is what is not gonna be focused with this change. That's the point of today's change when it comes to the Mythic Plus tuning. The fact that with this change you will be focusing more on the staying alive portion of Mythic Plus over the just blast, just go in and blast as much as you can. With this being said, we also have the recap portion of the changes to Mythic Plus for the incoming season. We will see, of course, if they will stick with this or come up with other extra changes. But for today, on this Friday, now is all we have to point out. We are starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with everyone else who is supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, there is a bug in my room, which keeps flying around, and then I turn, and then it disappears. And then I turn again, and it starts moving.